Welcome to History 2010. I'm Dr. Sawyer. I'll be your professor for today and hopefully for the rest of the semester. Guys, it was a beautiful weekend. You're probably looking at me and you're thinking, he looks different. He looks different. I do look different, guys. I turned 42 yesterday, so I'm double 21. Half the guys in this room are just trying to get to 21. I've already got there twice. So, thank you. I appreciate that. It was a pretty good birthday. I just chill, which is all I ever want to do. I just want to chill. Solomon was kind of a punk, though. He didn't want that to happen. But in the end, I got the best of him because I can put him to bed. So that's what we did. So let's put history knowledge to bed. Because that's not a very good transition, right? I mean, look, I'm 42. Like, I'm older now, and I can't even like move transitions. Let's see. I'll have to warm it up for this year. So last time in class, we were talking about the Constitution. You guys took the Constitution quiz. I am this week going to make, number one, a video going over the most commonly incorrectly answered questions on the quiz. I mean, that sounds like everybody did terrible on it. They didn't. But there were a couple of questions that a lot of people overall missed. I mean, of course, you guys didn't get every question. There were like more than twice as many possible questions as the ones you got. But I'll go over the ones that people missed as a way to like explain it to people and also to kind of use them to teach you more about the Constitution. Voluntary to watch that. I'll let you know when it's up. I'm also going to be making a video soon about the midterm exam, just to walk you through that. It's pretty basic. Shouldn't be too hard for anybody to figure out, as long as you've been keeping up on everything. Again, my commitment is if you put in the work, then I make sure that you all get reasonable assignments. So, again, midterms next week. As I said in your discussion sessions, it is in your regularly scheduled class times on Thursday and Friday of next week. Okay, it will be open for 60 minutes. We'll open the classes. I'll open the exam basically 5 minutes before, and it will stay open 5 minutes after your exam period. Everything will be in the video. Cool. I just want to address that and tell you guys everything's fine. Everything's under control. You guys are doing well in the class. You're going to do well on that. Cool. Boom. All right. Let's move on. Hit to the review slide. Here you go. Review the Constitution. Does anyone have any questions about the content of the class, about anything we covered? Jenna, yeah. The House brings impeachment charges, right? So an impeachment is accusing of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the accusation. The Senate doesn't impeach at all. The Senate tries the impeachment, right? So in this case, if you think about it, like the House is the arresting officer, and the Senate is the court. And the Constitution specifies that 2/3 of the Senate must vote to impeach for it to happen. It can happen to any federal officer, really, except for the House and the Senate, who have their own rules for doing those things. But yeah, and it says specifically that in the case when the president would be impeached, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that hearing. Right? That's specific there. It doesn't apply to other cases. Does that make sense, Jenna? Yes, sir. I just felt a little bit confused. Okay, awesome. Yeah. No, the Senate has nothing to do with the impeachment except for trying it, right? But the House, no matter if 100% of the House thought right now that the president was guilty of something, right, of violating it, if they couldn't convince the House, the Senate can't do anything, right? Again, the Senate has that. There in a lot of ways the Senate presides over and approves things, right? Has to approve presidential appointments, has to approve treaties, and then has to improve the House. The Senate is a very, very powerful organization, right? And that's again, Senate senior, right? The root is rested in that it's like chamber of seniors, right? Of folks who are older that have seen more, and that's the idea. So yeah. All right, excellent. Anybody else have a question about the content we covered? All right, then let's move on. We're going to go back and we're going to talk a little more about the actual convention that produces the Constitution. And then we're going to move into the first government today. The three major issues, as you guys, and I think it's interesting going over this after I've had you guys study it, because I think you can see it when you look at what happens there. The three major issues, number one, is representation, right? There are small states there. There are small states like Connecticut, right, that have small populations, and then there are massive states, like Virginia is the largest state at the time. But Virginia has a lot of people. New York has a lot of people. And so you got to strike this balance. How are you going to figure out a way that the states are represented, but also the people are represented? And they strike that in this compromise, which is you have two houses of Congress. The lower one being the House of Representatives, where it's based on population, and the people directly elect those individuals. And then the Senate, in which every state has equal representation. That's one thing that you can't change in the Constitution. It says in there, this is not subject to change. So you have that balance of power there. It's really interesting the way it plays out. And this has been, because of this compromise at the time, moving forward 200 years, you have such a much more diverse economy, a much more diverse set of cultures here. Now that you move from 13 states along the coast to across the continent, and it is some people have been calling for the Senate to be changed in some way, simply because if you think about how representation happens in the Senate. And particularly because of the Electoral College and the way that that's shaped, because the Electoral College is the number of votes you have is your total number of seats in Congress, right? So a state could theoretically have one person in it. Of course, this isn't going to happen, right? But I'm just saying, like, a state could have one person in it, and it would be guaranteed the two senators, plus guaranteed, remember, no matter how small your population, every state is guaranteed at least one seat in the House, and there are states that have west that have just one seat because of their population. But in the Electoral College, they have 3 electoral votes. That would mean one person alone would be responsible for 3 votes in this obviously absurd, but theoretical situation to kind of illustrate. That's up for folks to decide, right? You can't change the number of seats in the Senate, but you could change the way that the president is elected, and there are a lot of different ways you could do that, and that's been the topic I've seen people bring up more and more. Particularly because of the fact that, what is it? Let's see. If you look and, go from the year 2000 to 2016, in those years you have 5 presidential elections, and in 2 out of the 5, the winner of the presidency did not win the popular vote. So, some people have been calling for a change for that. There was almost a change made. The Electoral College was almost eliminated in the 1960s, actually, and it failed to get through. But there's popular support for it at that moment. And so, it's something worth talking about, for a lot of folks. I'll go ahead and say out front, it's important to remember that whatever you think about the way the outcome has gone on the last elections, that's the way it's always worked. No one stacked the deck that way on purpose. This hasn't been a recent development. It has been something that's been in the Constitution since the very beginning. But like a lot of things, when the Constitution fails to do what we want it to, right, as a country, we have been willing to change it in the past. Sometimes we haven't, right? Up to you. Anyway, so that issue of representation is worked out there. Senate, equal representation, House, population. The second issue that is looming at this time is the issue of slavery. These states are, and remember, Rhode Island's not there, but you have states that are all there, and you need 9 of the, well, first of all, you need to get it through this convention, but then you need 9 of the 13 states to ratify it. And you have Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland to a less degree, but in North Carolina to, kind of second place in terms of the least concern. But they nevertheless have those populations there. And so there's this question of slavery on the table. Most states in the Union still have slavery at this time. Massachusetts has banned it at this point. But overall, you have states that, just one second. Oh my God.
I did it. Taxi?
Did that tree fall on you? Whoa! Sorry, not going to bring Solomon back in here and shake him at you again, but he was the reason that I walked out of the room, that little guy, that rascal. Anyway, so you have this concern that states that have slavery will walk out of the room if it's even brought up. And so for this entire summer where they meet to discuss all of these things, basically just a couple of days where the issue of slavery is even addressed. And they all realize that that if the states like Massachusetts take a hard line on it, or states like South Carolina take a hard line on it, it could break down this entire convention. And so what they decide to do is just mostly ignore it, but not totally. If you look at the way that representation is worked out in the House, the way you count the population, the end result is that enslaved people are counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of the census. And since you know that a state's power in the House, right, the number of seats in the House is tied to population, and you know that the number of electoral votes in the Electoral College is tied to the total number of seats in the House, you understand why this is such a powerful thing. Because you have a population that southern states consider property. They consider property. But then when it comes time to count people, they're like, well, we definitely got to count these people, right? It's kind of an interesting balance where, like, at one moment they're like, hey, you can't take it away. Remember, life, liberty, and the right to property, you can't take our property away, but also they're people. Can we count them? And the end result is the 3/5 compromise, right? And this is going to give the southern states a real advantage at the time in both the House and in terms of the Electoral College. It's going to get even more intense as slavery spreads through the Deep South, and once Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, all of that become part of the U.S. But we'll get there, and we'll talk about how that plays out then. The point is, that's one way they address it. A second way they address it is that says the importation of such people as is deemed appropriate. I can't remember the exact wording. It shall not be abandoned until 1808, basically. That is addressing the international slave trade. You won't know that if you just read those words. But the issue of the slave trade is addressed there, and the deal is that it will not be shut down until basically 10 years after the Constitution signed, and then that decision can be opened up. If you want to understand how this all plays out, it's important to understand where things were with the country at that point. Because it is fair to say in one way, it's like, well, this was an issue that they knew they were going to have to address. What they don't know sitting in that room is that this issue will actually be addressed in one of the bloodiest wars. In terms of casualties, the highest number we've ever seen as a country, because all Americans died. Later on, that question will be resolved with blood. But in the course of the history of slavery in the United States, there's a way for the people who oppose slavery in the room to feel as if this might not be as big of a problem as it becomes. And let me explain to you. I'm not justifying this. I'm not trying to redeem them. I'm simply telling you, at this time, the modern slave economy in the United States by the end of the 1780s, it looked as if plantation slavery was going to die off. The crops that were developed by plantations, rice and tobacco, those markets were beginning to be less profitable. And in fact, if you look at the people, like you look at Thomas Jefferson, or you look at George Washington, you look at the individuals that you know of that owned slaves at the time, or owned slaves. You can't own another human being, is my philosophy. But for the terminology, they would have been plantation owners, I guess. For these folks, they're in debt when they die. Right? The whole time Washington's going to be president, he's going to be basically taking loans out from the late 18th century's version of like pawnbrokers, like desperate loans. Jefferson dies massively in debt. It's because their households are a part of this economy that's dying off, and so a lot of the people in there go, look, if we force this, they'll walk out. This is a dying institution. What they don't see, like so many of us can't see the future, what they don't understand is that the invention of the cotton gin is going to change the world, that the power that comes out of an industrialized Great Britain is going to rest on manufacturing, and that manufacturing is going to be in textiles, which is going to create an incredible surge for cotton. And those things together are, within a decade or so after this convention, going to begin breathing new and more horrible life into the institution of American slavery. The cotton plantation that is created in the early 19th century is out of a horror film. It is, we're taught, or at least I was taught, that it was all kind of the same. And as I'll explain in the lecture when we get to it on slavery, what's going to happen once things go to cotton and the incredible profitability is, you guys know about the Industrial Revolution, right? You know about the machines that were invented, about steam power, about the cotton gin. You've heard about all of this. But what you never think about is, well, where does all that cotton come from to fuel all of it? The agricultural production techniques in slavery, the technology, in cotton, the technology changes for sure. But in terms of the actual output created by new machines, it's pretty slim. The actual innovation of the cotton plantation is not a tool, it's essentially torture, psychological warfare against people, to make them live in fear of their lives. That's what's going to happen. These folks in the room can't see that. So in a way, they have, we humans, we figure out ways to rationalize almost anything. We're good at that. If our feet aren't held to the fire, we can walk away and say, well, I couldn't do anything about it. Or, that's the way it is, or I'm sure it's not that bad. We all do that, don't we? All of us own technology that was produced by people who don't live lives we want. I'm not redeeming them. I'm simply saying that we all, we know what that's like. And at that time, that was the worldview. It's probably going to go away. So there you go. The third issue, as we talked about, and this one is fought over a matter of days and days and days and weeks, is the issue of a national executive. I told you these folks fear consolidated political power, fear consolidated military power. A lot of them do not want to have an executive. They only are willing to agree to it after, over a decade of miserable failure with the Articles. And when they do it, there's only one person that anybody in that room imagines will hold that job. It's George Washington. And as I said, Washington is actually going to be the one that sets a lot of the precedents. You read Article 2 of the Constitution. It's pretty vague. Washington, when he gets to work, his job is going to be filling in the gaps, figuring out what it is an executive does. And he's going to do that pretty well. Well, to the point that a lot of what the president does, even today, is shaped by him. One of the questions, though, they have to deal with is, who is going to elect the president? So the first proposal is Congress will elect the president. And some people point out pretty quickly, and I think smartly, well, if you just let Congress pick the president, dude, the minute that the president doesn't do something Congress wants them to do, they'll just throw him out of power, right? They'll put somebody in there, and then the executive will essentially just be the minion of Congress. I guess that's a point. Of course, if you read the Constitution, it's kind of what the job is laid out to do. So there's that balance, but people back off of that, and then they say, how are we going to elect this person? They eventually reach the idea of the Electoral College, again, because they are really worried about what would happen if you let the common people vote in the middle of Shays' Rebellion and everything. But that's actually brought up. When they talk about how to elect the president, this is brought to the fore. A guy named Gouverneur Morris, who is from New York but representing Pennsylvania at this convention, on one day says, I think we should let the people pick the president. They will always pick someone who is worthy of the honor. And after he says this, George Mason from the state of Virginia stands up and says, more or less, the idea of letting the people pick the president makes as much sense as letting a blind person pick the best color. They are, in other words, he's saying they can't do it. And he and other ones agree with him that the people will always be duped by some designing individual, right? They always have this phrase, designing. In other words, someone who has their own plans, right? They're not worried about the actual doing the job. They want something for themselves. And he's like, the people will they're not educated enough. They won't be able to do it. And so the compromise they reach is the Electoral College, by which you have people that are kind of a couple of steps away from themselves being elected. But those people are the ones who pick the president. I think that most Americans don't quite understand the spirit of loathing of the national population that is in the air at the Constitutional Convention. They regularly talk about, basically the rabble. What will they do if they had power? They got no business having it. And this is at a time when everyone in that room assumes that it will be white men over the age of 21 who own property that can vote. So, it's a lot trickier than you think. Again, this convention is held in secret. No one knows what's going on in the room, and they have to keep it completely on the down low. They were authorized to change the Articles of Confederation, and they've decided to scrap the whole thing and write an entirely new document. They're not sent there with the authority to do that. So it means this whole summer, they're tight-lipped everywhere they go. It means that a lot of people don't take many notes because notes are evidence. It's why Madison's notes, again, are so important in this Constitutional Convention, because Madison is the one who documents it thoroughly for Thomas Jefferson, largely. So Jefferson can know what's going on in the room. Jefferson is abroad serving as a diplomat for the United States. There's one more story I wanted to tell you guys about this. It's on the tip of my... Oh, yeah. One of my favorite stories about the Constitutional Convention, though, and one that I think, actually, I know this is useful for people, because I try to find lessons in history that can inspire you guys. Lessons where you really see something getting done that you can apply in your life. There are two great lessons in the way that Madison deals with the Constitutional Convention that I think are essential. So when Madison arrives here, Madison shows up with a plan he's already written for the Constitution. He's been spending tons of time reading, and these guys know history. He's reading on all the old republics. At this time, a lot of the founders' shape of the world, the way they understand the potential for a democracy, is shaped by a book that had recently come out called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic. And Rome, in these guys' mind, was the last attempt at a real democracy, and that it had fallen. And so people were looking, how could this, one of the most powerful empires ever, just collapse? And one of the lessons they had, and you'll see this coming up shortly with Washington's farewell address, is the fear that it got too big. But it's in their minds. Madison read about them. He read about other attempts at democracy. He looked back to the Athenians. He looked everywhere, and he put together what he thought was a plan for a government that would implement the best parts of what had been tried with throwing out the risks that were built into other democracies. And so he shows up, and it's called the Virginia Plan. And he shows up, and this, friends, this plan that he's worked on is going to set the agenda for these debates. It's going to provide a framework. It's going to lay out essentially the way that they start talking about the Constitution. Now, other people have plans. There's a New Jersey plan and all of this, but Madison's is the most thorough, and people kind of look to it as like, all right, we debate this part, we'll debate this part. And the end Constitution isn't exactly what Madison put together, but by shaping the agenda, he has a lot of power. So lesson number one, guys, and this applies to your life. Have you guys ever been on a committee with somebody, been in a group, like you've been in a group project or something, or a committee at your church, or a committee in your fraternity, sorority? You guys, like 5 of you guys are like a subcommittee, and you have to put on an event, or you have to provide food or something like that. Have you guys ever done that? And you show up and nobody has an idea of what to do? You guys ever been there? Yeah, what do you guys do? You're like, wouldn't it be cool? You waste a lot of time. Now, have you ever been on a committee like that where you show up, 5 of you on the committee, 4 of you guys show up totally unprepared with no plan, and 1 person shows up with a clear agenda of how to handle what you're going to do? You guys ever been in that situation? You live long enough, you'll be in that situation. And what happens when you're in that situation is when the 1 person has a plan and the other 4 people are like, the other 4 people go with the other person's plan. Lesson 1 is if something matters, show up with your own plan, because that puts you in the advantage. If you want something to happen, show up with a plan. The second lesson from Madison here is that when Madison shows up at the Constitutional Convention, he is a known quantity. People know what he wants. He was at the Annapolis Convention. He wants a stronger federal government. A lot of people are suspicious of him. I know you guys can imagine that people in politics would, that people would already decide whether they like or dislike somebody's ideas based on whether or not they like them. I know it's a world that we can't conceive of now. But at this time, That was a regular thing. And so Madison knows that if he shows up and goes, hey guys, I've got an idea, a lot of people in the room aren't even going to listen to the idea because that's James Madison's idea. And you guys know how James Madison hates America. James Madison. They didn't have commercials like that back then. They had newspapers. That was pretty shady. So Madison shows up and he's like, man, I put all this work into this. If I tell them it's mine, they won't listen to me. So he passes it off to a guy that way fewer people know, a guy named Edmund Randolph, another representative from Virginia. And Edmund Randolph stands up and is like, hey, I've got an idea for how we can do this. And people are willing to read it. And that's how it becomes the framework. And lesson 2 is don't let your ego get in your own damn way. Right? You work on something. I know how I know how it is. You work on something, you'll be like, look what I did, right? I mean, Solomon's in there building something out of Legos. Like, look what I did. Not even that impressive, But when we do things, we want people to see it, right? We want people to know that we did it. But Madison said, I got something to get done. So he passed it off to Randolph. Now, obviously, he told people later on that he did it, right? You can too. But in the meantime, swallow your pride, sit back. If the idea is good, and you're afraid that people might think that you are the problem, let the idea be presented in some other way. Right? Good ideas will rise. So there's your 2 lessons. Show up with a plan and don't let your ego get in your way. The reason I used to say I think this could be effective for people, but now I know that it's effective for people, is because like 3 or 4 years ago, because I've been teaching these lessons from Madison, inspired by Joanne Freeman, who laid out the first one and then kind of explained the second one in a lecture I saw by her, but kind of putting them in my own words. I've been giving these lessons because I think they're really valuable. And I had got an email from a student who was running for president of the Business and Economics Club. I don't know. It's a pretty great fraternity that we have, like an academic fraternity we have. And he said that he wanted to be the president, and he wanted to run for president of the society. And he said when he was trying to think about, because he basically had some things he wanted to do, he thought would help the society. He said when he sat down to think about how he was going to give a speech to everybody, he said he remembered what he had learned from my class about James Madison. And he said he showed up with a clear set of plans. And he said the other 2 people running just talked about things like, hey, I think this should be a better club. I think that we have really great people here. I think blah, blah, blah. And he wanted a landslide. And he said, he wrote me an email. He said, thanks, Dr. Sawyer. I was like, don't thank me. Thanks, James Madison. He's the one who taught me about it, But just remember that. Show up with a plan. Cool. So that's kind of an overview of what happened there. I've got links to the notes that you can access in the extras folder for last week. Now, they get through passing this. They get it out of the room. They're like, surprise, we wrote the entirely new document. They send it off to the Articles Congress. They go, okay, sure. Yeah, it's like one thing they can do, I guess, is be like, yeah, you can replace us if people vote for it. So they pass it off to the states, and the states start fighting about it. I talked about this before. I talked about it in the discussion sessions, how the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists fight each other, and how it really comes down to the wire, with some of these states being very close votes. It takes almost a year. It's not until June 21st, 1788, that New Hampshire becomes the 9th state to ratify. That puts it into effect. My favorite thing is this. All right, look, they come out of the room on September 17th, right? They come out and they're like, hey, we've got this. And you look, it takes other states, like 6 months of fighting about it, 7-8 months of fighting about it before they ratify it. But Delaware's just like, yeah, hey, yeah. They just do it. Delaware's like, yeah, heck yeah, we're all in on this. And I don't know exactly why Delaware did it, but I kind of figure that Delaware did it because there's just nothing else to do in Delaware. Have you guys been to Delaware before? Have you guys been to Delaware? Have anybody here been? No, exactly. Why would you go to Delaware? They know it. And they were just like, wow, something to do. Let's ratify this Constitution. They ratified it right away. And it's the coolest thing that's ever happened in Delaware. That's the only thing. And if you guys don't believe me, go look at a Delaware license plate today. You know what a Delaware license plate says? It says the first state. That's how little there is to do in Delaware. At first, they were just like, let's ratify the Constitution. 240 years later, they're like, let's put it on our license plate. I don't know what else we even put on there except for that we ratified. Remember that one time we had something to do? It was awesome. That's Delaware, ladies and gentlemen. People of Delaware are very proud people. I'm sure they're angry at me for saying this right now. But let's face it. What else do you know about Delaware? Exactly. Now you know something. the first state. Didn't make up the first state. Didn't kick in until all 9 signed. They all became the first state at the same time. Whatever, Delaware. Why am I picking on Delaware? That's ridiculous. Yeah, what's up, Delaware? Let's move on. They get into fights, and this is what I love. It's like it's something that's occurred to me over time. Is what happens in these debates is you have a series of papers that are written on both sides, right, for the Constitution and against it. And the Federalists win out. The Federalists are the people who argue for the Constitution. A series of papers is written by John Jay. He writes a couple of them. He's going to be on the Supreme Court later on. He's an important diplomat. We don't talk about him a ton here, but he writes a few of them. James Madison writes a lot of them. Hamilton writes 51 of them, of like the 85, I think, that are produced. So Hamilton is going nonstop at this, as the musical says. And they win. On the other hand, you have the Anti-Federalists who are against it. And one of the big reasons the Anti-Federalists cannot make the argument that the Federalists make is that an argument for the Constitution can be central in a way that several people from different places can argue for it. Whereas the arguments against the Constitution were very different in each state. A reason for a North Carolinian not to sign it is very different than a reason for a person in Connecticut not to sign it. They have very different economies, but the arguments for the Constitution is, the argument for the Constitution, it works for a lot of places. Like the common theme is the federal debt, and no one has a better plan to solve it. And so the two sides here, the Federalists are the ones who are arguing for it, and the Anti-Federalists are the ones who are against it. And students get confused by this, and I get it, because later on we're going to have political parties, right? At this time we don't. But later on, we're going to have political parties, and the first two are going to be called the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. And so we have Federalists that are a political party, and we have a group called the Federalists when we talk about this debate. But let me just tell you, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are positions on an issue. And it's one of these things where the modern world can blind you to what we're talking about. Just imagine that people could fiercely fight together on a single position without agreeing about anything else. I know that sounds bizarre because modern political parties are something of a package deal. Feel this way about abortion, so I guess I like guns now. But at this time, you brought people as completely different as Madison and Hamilton. And as you'll see, once the first political parties get set up, those guys are like at the forefront of destroying the other one. But at this point, they had something in common. They bound around it. They fought together for it because they didn't have to agree on anything else. It was a fight for a position. It's a good thing. The Anti-Federalists don't win out because there's another lesson in this. All right? What are the Federalists for? A federal government. What are the Anti-Federalists for? They're for not a federal government. They're defined by what they're against, right? Which is not a single position. And this gets another important lesson about rhetoric in America. I had a great professor at Michigan State, institutional econ professor, and he talked about the way that we argue for things. And he said, if you want to understand American politics and American culture, you have to understand that in American political rhetoric, there are two great high grounds that if you can seize, you can usually win your argument. So one is the high ground that my position is that which is most free, the freest position, right, in line with liberty. And the other great hill is that my position is most in line with nature. And he said if you want an example of how strongly those two hills are, you simply need to look at debates in American politics where two sides of that debate have both seized one of those two hills, and you find that those are the ones that are the most difficult for us to resolve. And the one he pointed out was abortion. This isn't me saying anything for or against it, right? I mean, again, these are your positions, but he brought this up in terms of a rhetorical context. And he said, if you think about it, you have two positions. You have pro-life. They have seized the great high ground in American rhetoric of that which is most natural. What's more natural than life? And on the other hand, you have the position of those who want to see abortion legal, they say it's pro-choice. They have seized the great high ground of liberty, that one has choice with their body, right? And he says, obviously, and let me just say, obviously this is a far more complicated issue than this. I'm not trying to reduce it to this. But in terms of rhetoric, you see they both seize the high ground. I now want you to imagine how different it would look if you had an argument between pro-life and the anti-life movement. Or you had an argument between the pro-choice and the anti-choice movement. That would not be much of a hill. It'd be like, hey man, I'm pro-life. It's like, not me, man, not me. I'm anti-life. It's like, wow, that's actually what, never mind. Seen a tattoo like that somewhere. Anyway, so you have this two-sided argument, right? And if you think about like the for position, the anti-federalists are just against something, right? It's another thing to remember. It's works better when you make your arguments for something there. So there we go. Rhode Island, old Rhode Island, 1790, they show up. Congress has already been kicking it for a year by the time these guys roll in. Rhode Island's so weird. They don't show up at the Constitutional Convention. They don't even go to ratify it. At one point, like Washington is already president for about a year before these guys join up. And Washington has to go somewhere, like, as a part of his travels. And he goes a longer way to not go through Rhode Island because he says he would not like to visit a foreign country on his trip. And Rhode Island's probably like, shit. And then they shortly thereafter, they're like, I don't know, man. Washington's bad side might be a bad idea. They finally join in, Rhode Island, little Rhode Island, God bless, still the smallest one, man. So you finally have the government put in place. And guys, I know what you're thinking. You're like, man, they're feeling strong, aren't they? They're feeling great. They're like, knock this out, man. It took a lot of fight, and they're all feeling really positive about it, right? That's what you guys are thinking, and that's really sweet. Let me just read you some quotes here. Oh, come on. I don't know what happened. This happened last time. I'll get back to these. I'll read these in the next lecture once I figure out what the heck happened to my old notes, which I usually search and put into new notes. But there are some great quotations where after this, like your founding fathers are just like, the world is an eggshell. Everything is about to fall apart. We imagine that this must have been like the best moment, like where everyone's just like, yeah, we did it. It is not. They barely passed a second government in like a dozen years, and the first one failed miserably. A lot of the same people worked on this one. No clue if it's even going to work. Who the hell is going to buy into it? Are people going to believe it? Remember, documents, laws, they're all stories. They're all rules. If you don't follow them, they don't matter. And so they come to me and they are absolutely worried that this is going to fail too. First Congress meets in April 1789. So basically, as it goes, they ratify the Constitution, right, in June of 1788. They then begin to hold elections. States vote for their representatives. The Electoral College votes. Washington is unanimously elected president. John Adams gets second most. John Adams is going to be the vice president. John Adams is going to say that the vice presidency is the most useless position ever conceived by the minds of men, which is really great quote out of it. Like, we're like, Washington's setting the agenda, and we're like, Adams is just angry because nobody cares what he does, and he doesn't get invited to the meetings of the presidential case. He's angry, dude. We'll get to him. Washington is inaugurated April 30th, 1789. I assigned you his inaugural address this week because it is beautiful. It's like all things where Washington has been given a job that he does not want but will take because he has been told that this is him serving his country. And I read you in a previous lecture his entire speech when he was appointed commander-in-chief by the Second Continental Congress. And you see the same spirit in his inauguration address, his first one. I am here to serve. I will not take a salary. I do not believe I am up to this, but I will give it all I've got in service of my country. Later on, the capital of the country is going to be not far from George Washington's house on the Potomac, Washington, D.C., but that has not been settled by this point. Washington's presidency will be served in New York and then in Philadelphia, which is much further away, which keeps him away from the place he wants to be. When he is sworn in, he kind of to himself plans that he will only serve 2 years and step down. He ends up serving 8 because these kids are going to start fighting with each other, and Washington's got to be around for as long as he can. And finally, just like me, you just walk outside of the room when you're lecturing and you're like, look, I've had enough of this. And then you just walk away. So, that's what I went. I told my family, I was like, wherever you guys leave. And I don't know if it worked or not. Probably not. Just kidding. I would never say that. But if I were Washington, I think I'd rather have 8 Solomons than be the president at this point. When they get to this when they get to this first meeting of government, there are major issues they have to resolve quick. The first one, as I said, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is it's got to be done. A lot of the states said they would only join under the Constitution kind of tentatively under the assurance that their rights they were concerned about were added to the Constitution through amendment. James Madison's elected to the first House of Representatives. He gets to work on this, and so does everyone else. It moves pretty smoothly, and as you guys know, already by December of 1791, the 10 amendments are added. Send 12 out. The other 2 don't get ratified at the time. Funny story, though. The 2 amendments that didn't get ratified in 1791, one of them gave a very specific total of population, 2 seats in the House. If it had been ratified, we'd have I think it's 2,000 members of the House now. So, it didn't pass. But the other one was an amendment that said that if Congress gave itself a raise, that raise would only take effect after Congress was up for re-election. Right? Because in the Constitution, Congress decides how much Congress gets paid. I don't know about you guys. If I decided how much I got paid, I'd be making a lot more money. So they're worried Congress could go in there and make themselves rich and just jack up their pay. And the amendment, that amendment that got sent out said, yeah, go ahead and vote for yourself a raise. And you'll get it if we elect you back. You go jacking up your own pay, we'll vote you out. We'll vote in people that'll change the pay back down to normal. That didn't make it in that year. Anybody know what happened to that amendment? Anybody know what happened to that one? That's right, Jenna. It's the 27th Amendment. That amendment sat dormant for 200 years. And it's an amazing story because in the 1970s, I believe, a law student wrote a paper in law school arguing that amendment was still actually eligible to become added to the Constitution because 3/4 of the states hadn't voted on it because only 13 had voted on it originally. He said now that we got 50 states, we could actually still get the 3/4 votes and add it to the Constitution. And the professor in the law school gave him a C on the assignment and was like, that's preposterous. And this guy set out to get this amendment ratified, and it was added to the Constitution as the 27th Amendment. It's an insane story. But I think the lesson is, don't give up. Keep looking for those keys, man. It took this amendment 200 years to get there. 200 years of failure. Believe in yourselves. Read the 27th Amendment. So the Bill of Rights moves along. The second one is dividing the executive and judicial. The second one is approving and defining the executive and judicial branches of government. Remember, it says there will be executive officers. It doesn't say what they are. Washington begins creating these institutions that are going to last to today. He creates the Department of State, which oversees our diplomacy. He appoints Thomas Jefferson as the Secretary of State. Makes sense. Jefferson's been serving abroad. So there you go. He creates the Department of War, which today is the Department of Defense. It's changed in the 20th century. Department of War. Who does he appoint to that? Well, if you were going to appoint somebody to the Department of War, you'd want somebody who could get things done. Like, for example, dragging dozens of cannon across a cold, winter, frozen New York all the way to Boston. So he appoints Henry Knox. The guy remember the guy, the guy who's the bookseller, the guy who used to own a bookstore and then suddenly became an officer and dragged those cannon across? Yeah, that's who, that's the first one. Knoxville, Fort Knox. You name things after a guy who does that. He creates the Attorney General's office and he appoints, ta-da, Edmund Randolph. Remember the guy who stood up at the Constitutional Convention and nobody really knew who he was and presented Madison's idea? That guy becomes the Attorney General. By the way, he's also corrupt as hell. He's going to get thrown out of office and defamed a couple years later. I don't get much into that, but that's his story. And then the nightmare scenario. The branch of government that's going to have to deal with the economy and dealing with the debt. Washington is like, who in the hell could do this? Who understands the economy? Who understands anything about how we could put together a plan to try to fix this? And when Washington begins thinking about who is equipped and has the skill set to deal with the economy, there's only one person's name who comes to his mind. Who is it? Anybody know? To take the lead as the Secretary of Treasury? That's what a lot of people think. Actually, it wasn't. It was Robert Morris. The first person that comes to Washington's head is Robert Morris, the guy who had done this job under the Articles, a guy who's kind of a financial wizard. But here's the thing. He's really good at it. And so when Washington's like, hey, you want to captain this sinking ship? Robert Morris is like, I'm good. But remember your boy Hamilton? I was talking to him. He's actually pretty good at it. Hamilton's actually his second choice. And that's the guy who's crazy enough to come in and take the position. A lot of people in the musical, it's like, he's like, Hamilton's like, Washington's like, I've got to have you back, man. I've got to have you back. Please come and work for me. I need your help. And he's like, hey, Robert Morris said you'd be good at this. And I love you, man. I hadn't seen you in a while. You've been in New York. You've been up in Albany being a lawyer. And this brings them back together. The two issues, though, ladies and gentlemen, that are not going to go so smoothly are number 3 and 4 on this list. The Constitution specifies that there will be a national capital, but does not say where it will be. The obvious choice is northern cities because they're the most populous, they have the most resources. But guess what? Southern plantation owners don't like the idea of the capital being so far away because with all that anti-slavery sentiment up there in those big cities like New York and Philadelphia, that puts them at a real disadvantage. They're going to drag their feet on it. Problem is they ain't got a city to move it into. You move it to Charleston? Yeah, let's convince everybody from the north to come down to Charleston for Congress to meet. But they're stalling. And the fourth one here is how the hell are you going to deal with this economy? And how in the world are we going to pay off the debt? We paid soldiers in worthless paper money. We have debt to France. We have debt to our own citizens. And we have no way to pay it. Those two issues, friends, are going to be the biggest fights and going to lead to the formation of the party system and lead to the divisiveness that you guys all know and love in the United States of America. It's got a long history. That's a wrap for today's lecture. Thank you for being here and have a great day.